Okay, so let us start. So welcome everyone to this joint Finance Watch and Club of Rome event. We are delighted to have seen so much interest over the past few days for this event. We had almost 200 registrations. It's a pleasure working with Sandrine and co-organizing this. There's a lot of synergies between the Club of Rome and more specifically the Rethinking Finance Impact Hub and the work of Finance Watch. So we're delighted to work together. I also want to thank a list of top-level speakers who accepted to join this event. I think it'll contribute a lot to the quality of the discussions. I was thinking before taking the word, basically why are we here, essentially. So we're here to discuss about two things. We're here to discuss about nature. We're here to discuss about finance. And in essence, let's face it, we're here because that relationship hasn't been very positive, to say the least. So finance, public finance, private finance has largely been the enabler of the destruction of biodiversity and ecosystems, the enabler of climate change. And at the same time, on the positive note, there's an increasing and fast increasing awareness of this problem and the need to reverse that situation and use finance as an enabler of a positive change towards an economy that is in harmony with nature. So this is what we're going to discuss today. And so, as I said, I think there's both a sense of urgency and sort of the gravity of the problem, and on the other hand, I think some sense of hope in terms of some of the proposals that are on the table, in terms of the broad awareness around the problem, and strangely enough, the opportunity provided by COVID-19 and its consequences, maybe to boost this transformation agenda that people have been talking about. So in terms of structure of the morning and this event, it largely follows the structure of a report Finance Watch published 2 weeks ago entitled Nature's Return. We look first at the ambition when it comes to nature and biodiversity. What are the objectives we aim to reach? What are the objectives the EU just published with a Biodiversity Strategy 2030. What should be the governance in terms of focusing on these targets in the coming years and making sure we align our economies and financial systems to these ambitious biodiversity targets? So that's the first discussion. There's a second discussion which focuses on public finance, which we think is key when it comes to nature and biodiversity. There's a public good dimension to this issue, which makes private finance, which will be the last discussion, maybe not a natural enabler in this space, although it can still do much more, and that'll be the discussion we have with the third panel. I'm also happy to announce Finance Watch is releasing this morning a beginner's guide, which is, if you like, the popular translation of our report and tries to get a broader audience on this topic, on the importance of the topic, and quite crucially on a few recommendations we think are crucial to align financial systems and economic systems with nature. I'm not going to talk much more. I'm going to hand the floor to Sandrine in a few seconds for an introduction to this morning. I just want to say we'd like this event to be as interactive as possible. So as I said, almost 200 registrations. I see almost half of these people have joined us already. You can ask questions to a whole panel, to specific panelists in the Q&A section of this Zoom call. So please feel free to start doing that as soon as possible. You can also interact on social media, maybe mainly Twitter, where we'll be tweeting through the session. The whole session will be recorded. We'll probably cut videos as part of the different panels for people who could not attend this morning. And possibly what we'll do is continue responding to your questions after the event is closed, as inevitably the event is limited in time. There's many things to discuss, and we might not be able to respond to all your questions during the events. So thanks a lot for joining. Thanks again for our seniors for joining us, and I'll hand the floor to Sandrine for a short introduction.
Thank you so much, Benoit, and I'm really pleased to be here as co-president of the Club of Rome. I think you probably all know that the Club of Rome has been talking about the importance of having a proper balance between nature and people for the last 50 years. What I find amusing and sad, of course, is that, as many of you know, we already launched our planetary emergency plan that brought the links between a New Deal for people, nature, and climate prior to the COVID outbreak. And I think it's symbolic of the fact that so many leaders were not properly listening to what many of us were saying across the different systems links. So whether it be epidemiologists, whether it be climate specialists, whether it be nature specialists, or even within the finance and the economic sectors, where we were saying we need new values. We need to move away from indicators to growth in a purely GDP sense and move on. I think what's important is that this was going to be the super year. 2020 was going to be the year where we were starting to look at COP26 and COP15, the Biodiversity COP, and their linkages as being fundamental in terms of how we start to draw those different system pieces together, from the finance side, from the economic side, putting the value on capital, looking at crisis management, etc. And then COVID hit. COVID, which for me as a zoonotic disease is clearly a symptom of the fact that we haven't properly looked at humanity's encroachment on the planetary boundaries. And so as we move into this very important discussion today, I'd like to lay the frame in a variety of different ways. The first is to look at connectivity. What we've done now through the Planetary Emergency Plan and the incredible partnership of more than 200 partners that we have is to look at how do we connect a healthy planet with healthy people. So when we move into the nature space and putting a value on nature, let's remember that we have to bring in the social implications. Otherwise, this will never fly. One of the key conversations that we have within the environmental movement is that we must take into consideration people and their relationship with nature, rather than nature totally separate from the livelihood conversation. Then we need to look at the tipping points. Right now, we are reacting to disaster. We are reacting to a pandemic, and yet we've seen complete transformational change within the last 2 months. We've seen that although we were told for many, many years, you cannot shift people's behaviors so quickly. From a climate perspective, that means we weren't going to be able to decarbonize as fast as so many of us had hoped, because people would not actually subscribe to that. But we've seen in the last few months that across the globe, there has been a complete shift in behavior because we've been forced to. So one of the key points in terms of addressing what we need to address today is how can we design for disaster rather than react to disaster? How can we take into consideration future crises? How can we put a value on nature and fully integrate that into our economy to ensure that not only our financial system is looking at natural capital, but our economic system is also firmly based on new indicators to growth. And then I'll bring in the last key point, which clearly is the role of the European Union. The European Union and the European Commission with the European Green Deal has started to anchor our recovery from COVID, but our future perspective in terms of the European Green Deal. Incredibly important also in the new links that we've seen with the biodiversity proposal and the farm to fork proposal. Those which actually used to be siloed approaches, which were released at the same time. So I'd like to commend, as we again start our conversations, the incredible leadership of the European Union and all of us who are here, who of course must hold accountable member states as we move forward through that proposal. The proposal which both brings in the sustainable finance work that we've done in terms of a taxonomy and do no significant harm as the anchors and the criteria that are firmly necessary to move us out of COVID and into the recovery, a conditionality which many of us actually called for, but also the future work of sustainable finance, which is ongoing, and we will have an interview with Martin at the end of this session, where we will have to look at how we actually bring in biodiversity much more firmly into the criteria of the do no significant harm principles that we've put forward. We will have to look very clearly at the social criteria, which goes hand in hand with those do no significant harm principles, as well as moving from just green to a brown taxonomy. And we will need to think about how we bring ambition into this, not only just in the European Union, but with other countries. We know that the sustainable finance work that's being undertaken here and the way in which we're now rethinking of finance is actually being communicated to the rest of the world through the international platform that has been set up by the European Commission. And what's very important here is that in a couple of days, actually tomorrow, we will launch the new high ambition coalition of countries across the globe that are looking at nature and people, bringing together nature and people, where ministers will actually look at the foundations in order to make that work within an economic construct. So again, the work, the discussion that we have today could start to formulate some of the inputs that are fundamental for that discussion that is happening at the ministerial level across the globe, led by the French and also the Costa Rican ministries. So I'll leave you with that message. We're in the midst of a transformation. We have the European Union that has indicated that we cannot get out of this transformation by going back to business as usual. We have a clear message in terms of sustainable finance must be part of the way in which we recover, as should conditionality and our objectives with regard to climate change and environment. And we know that other countries are starting to come on board. Let's not forget that for the first time ever, the Chinese has decided not to use GDP growth as their main indicator of economic growth, and they've brought GDP growth down. This is a shift now in terms of how we can start to value nature and climate within our economic systems and within our underpinning financial system to ensure that capital flows where it needs to go, to both preserve nature, but also regenerate nature where possible, to be a real solution provider for getting us out of these crises that we are now calling a triple convergence of tipping points between nature, climate, and health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for this very clear introduction. I think you made a lot of very good points that need to come back in the discussion this morning. I will not repeat them, but I think clearly for me this sense of a transition moment, and both a huge opportunity with the recovery plan and the momentum sort of post COVID-19 and the questions that were asked. I think that every citizen felt were asked by this situation as an opportunity, but let's face it, there's also a major risk that the recovery plan and the post-COVID reaction is a back to normal. We hear definitely that the EU leadership has the ambition to avoid that, but let's face it, there's quite a few forces, I would say, out there, and some of the incumbents who are not so willing to embark on this transition. So I think now is really a key moment to push as much as we can.